Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm discussing Of Mice and Men, written by John Steinbeck. And I'm sure, like me, you had to read this book in high school as part of assigned reading. This book, of course, it's a classic in American literature, and it's actually a novella. A novella is classified as anywhere between 17,500 words and 39,999 words. Anything 40,000 words or more is considered a novel. And I just learned this, that a novelette is between 7,500 and 17,499 words. Anything under 7,500 words is considered a short story. And the title of Mice and Men is actually taken from a poem written by a man named Robert Burns. The poem is titled To a Mouse. And the specific line in modern English is, "The best laid schemes of mice and men often go awry." And so to me, what makes this book such a pivotal work of fiction in American literature, besides the plot itself, is the amount of foreshadowing leading up to the tragic ending. So let's get into it now. Our two protagonists are George Milton and Lenny Small. George is a small, sharp man, and Lenny is a big, kind guy, but doesn't know his own strength, and he's slow. He's mentally disabled. And our narrator, our omniscient narrator, describes the two characters as follows. The first man was small and quick, dark of face, with restless eyes and sharp, strong features. Every part of him was defined: small, strong hands, slender arms, a thin and bony nose. Behind him walked his opposite, a huge man, shapeless of face, with large, pale eyes, with wide, sloping shoulders, and he walked heavily, dragging his feet a little, the way a bear drags his paws. And so these two men, polar opposites in stature, they're a couple of ranch workers and they're on their way to their next job. And George gripes about how if Lenny weren't around, life would be much easier for him because he always gets him into trouble. And Lenny's feelings get hurt and he offers to go run away and he'll live in a cave for the rest of his life, but George tells him that he wants Lenny to stay with him. And to that point, one of the biggest themes in this novella is loneliness and the characters grappling with isolation. So George gives a speech and he says, "Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. They got no family. They don't belong no place. They come to a ranch and work up a stake, and they go into town and blow their stake. And the first thing you know, they're pounding their tail on some other ranch. They ain't got nothing to look ahead to." And then he goes on to say, "But not us." And Lenny gets excited saying, "But not us." And why? Because I got you to look after me, and you got me to look after you, and that's why. And so then George tells Lenny a story that he's told him many times before about how they're going to live up to their dream one day and buy a farm and own this piece of land together. And Lenny's always excited to hear this story because he wants to hear about how he'll get to tend the rabbits. Because a key characteristic about Lenny is that he loves to pet soft things, but in doing so, he ends up accidentally killing things. He's accidentally killed many mice, alluding to the title, and it gets worse later on in the story. And so, hinting at that, our first piece of foreshadowing is when George tells Lenny that if he gets into any trouble, he tells Lenny to wait for him here in the brush, because George talks about how they were first run out of town, a town called Weed, and Lenny doesn't remember why, and George tells him, "Well, if you don't remember, I'm not going to remind you." And then we later find out it was because Lenny had touched a girl's dress and he wouldn't let go, and then the woman accuses him of rape, and so the two of them are run out of town. So they arrive at this ranch for their next job. We meet Candy, who is an elderly ranch handyman, and he lost one of his hands in an accident. We also meet Curly, who's the boss's son, and he's this short, scrappy guy who's very angry and always wants to get into a fight. And Candy later says, well, tell you what, Curly's like a lot of little guys. He hates big guys. He's all the time picking scraps with big guys. Kind of like he's mad at him because he ain't a big guy. Well, Curly's pretty handy. Never did seem right to me. Suppose Curly jumps a big guy and licks him. Everybody says what a game guy Curly is. And suppose he does the same thing and gets licked. Then everybody says the big guy ought to pick on somebody his own size. And maybe they gang up on the big guy. Never did seem right to me. Seems like Curly ain't giving nobody a chance. And so again, this is foreshadowing that Curly's an antagonist, and he's going to be trouble for Lenny later on in the story. In that same vein, we also learn about Curly's wife, the only female character in this story, and she doesn't have a name. That's her identity, Curly's wife. There is also Lenny's Aunt Clara that's referenced to in the story, but she looked after Lenny and she had passed away. And so now George kind of looks after Lenny. A couple other ranch workers, though, are Slim and Carlson. Slim is the most revered and respected character in this story. He's the confidant. He's someone everyone can trust. And George, in fact, later talks to Slim and talks about his relationship with Lenny. And George says, funny, I used to have a hell of a lot of fun with him. Used to play jokes on him because he was too dumb to take care of himself. But he was too dumb to even know he had a joke played on him. I had fun. Made me seem goddamn smart alongside of him. Why, he'd do any damn thing I told him. And then a little later he says, tell you what made me stop that. One day a bunch of guys were standing around up on the Sacramento River. I was feeling pretty smart. I turns to Lenny and says, jump in, and he jumps. Couldn't swim a stroke. He damn near drowned before we could get him, and he was so damn nice to me for pulling him out. Clean forgot I told him to jump in. Well, I ain't done nothing like that no more. So George feels this obligation to take care of Lenny, and he felt guilty for taking advantage of him back then. And Slim says, he's a nice fella. Guy don't need no sense to be a nice fella. Seems to me sometimes it just works the other way around. Take a real smart guy and he ain't hardly ever a nice fella. And again, discussing loneliness as a key theme in this story, George says, I ain't got no people. I seen the guys that go around on the ranches alone. They ain't no good. They don't have no fun. After a long time they get mean. They get wanting to fight all the time. And they talk more about Lenny and how Lenny isn't mean, that he's a nice guy. And so later on in the story, in another key foreshadowing moment, Candy has this old dog who's basically not good for anything anymore. He's blind and it's difficult for him to walk. And so one of the ranch workers, Carlson, says that Candy should shoot the dog, put it out of its misery. And Candy can't bear to do that because he had the dog since he was a pup. He was a great sheepdog back in his day. He's attached to it. But they say that he's not doing him any favors by letting him live. But Carlson assures him that he could just shoot him in the back of the head, right where he wouldn't even feel it. And so finally, Slim is the one who convinces Candy that this is the best thing for the animal in the end. So Carlson takes the dog, brings it out, and after a couple minutes or so, they just hear a shot in the distance, and Candy is all solemn, but that's it. That was the best thing for the dog, sadly. And so later on in the story, Candy's talking to George, and he says, "You seen what they done to my dog tonight? They says he wasn't no good to himself nor nobody else. When they can me here, I wished somebody'd shoot me, but they won't do nothing like that." And so basically Candy struggles with his place in the world now and what he's good for anymore because he's getting old. And so then he ends up talking to George and wanting to get in on the plan of owning a piece of land with them because he says how he has money saved up, and George gets to explaining how there is a piece of land that he's had his eye on, and he talks about the amount and how they could pool their money together after Lenny and him get their money working on this ranch. And this is honestly pretty much the happiest moment in this entire novella. There's a line where the narrator says, "They fell into a silence. They looked at one another amazed. This thing they had never really believed in was coming true." And so it's this glimmer of hope that they're actually going to make this lifelong dream of theirs a reality. But furthering the action of the story, Lenny ends up getting into a fight with Curly, and it was because Curly was egging him on, and then he starts punching him, and then George yells at Lenny to defend himself. So Lenny grabs Curly's hand and doesn't let go. So Curly's hand ends up all broken, and Slim tells him, he urges Curly to say that his hand got caught in a machine, but they have to take Curly away, take him to the hospital. And so in the next section, there aren't chapters in this novella. In the next section, we get a deeper look at the character named Crooks. And Crooks is the only black character in the story. And he's more isolated than anyone. He doesn't even get to stay in the bunkhouse. He has his own little room near the barn. So the narrator says, "This room was swept and fairly neat, for Crooks was a proud, aloof man. He kept his distance and demanded that other people keep theirs." So Lenny ends up coming into his room because Lenny was left back at the ranch while George is out with a few of the other guys. And Crooks lets him come in, and he basically gets to talking to Lenny about how he has no one and how lonely he is. And Lenny tells him about how he and George are going to own a piece of land together and that George is going to let him tend the rabbits. And Crooks asks him, well, what if something happened to George? And that's when Lenny starts to get angry and says, who hurt George? But then Crooks explains, no, I was just supposing. And he says, suppose you couldn't go into the bunkhouse and play rummy because you was black. How'd you like that? Suppose you had to sit out here and read books. Sure, you could play horseshoes till it got dark, but then you got to read books. Books ain't no good. A guy needs somebody to be near him. A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. Don't make no difference who the guy is, long's he's with you, I tell ya. I tell ya, a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick. So, he's really opening up to someone for the first time since he's alone in this world, sadly. And yet, Lenny doesn't really understand because he doesn't have the mental capacity to. And then Candy comes by and he's talking to Lenny about how he's figuring out ways how they can make money off of the rabbits. And then a little later, Curly's wife comes by, again looking for Curly as she had done earlier in the story. And Candy says, Curly ain't been here. And she kind of looks around at the three men and then she says, they left all the weak ones here. Think I don't know where they all went? Even Curly. I know where they all went. She goes on to say, funny thing, if I catch any one man and he's alone, I get along fine with him, but just let two of the guys get together and you won't talk, just nothing but mad. You're all scared of each other, that's what. Every one of you's scared the rest is going to get something on you. And the interesting thing about Curly's wife and Curly himself is the fact that they never interact in this novella at all. They're always looking for the other, and the men talk about how Curly's wife has got the wandering eye. They call her things like a tart. She's like this symbolism of temptation. But it still all strings back to, because she herself is also lonely and unhappy with her life. So she finds out that Lenny's the one who hurt Curly's hand. And so jumping ahead now to the next section, Lenny's in the barn by himself and he's upset because he accidentally killed one of the puppies that he's been petting. It's a litter of puppies that one of the dogs had. And so he's upset because then he knows that George is going to be mad and he won't let him tend the rabbits. And then Curly's wife wanders in and she just wants to talk to Lenny because the boys are all out having a horseshoe tournament. And she tells Lenny about how she could have been in movies. And she talks about how she doesn't actually think Curly is a good man. She says, well, I ain't told this to nobody before. Maybe I oughtn't to. I don't like Curly. He ain't a nice fella. She goes on to say, could have been in the movies and had nice clothes, all them nice clothes like they wear, and I could have sat in them big hotels and had pictures took of me. When they had them previews, I could have went to them and spoke in the radio, and it wouldn't have cost me a cent because I was in the picture. And so Lenny's hesitant through all this, though, because George had told him to stay away from her, that she's trouble. And yet she just wants someone to talk to. And so then he's still just talking about the rabbits, and he tells her that he likes petting soft things. And she says, oh, well, my hair is soft. And so she lets him touch her hair. And then this is the climax of the story. He ends up accidentally, his hand gets stuck in her hair. She screams at him to let go, and he tells her to be quiet because he doesn't want her to get him in trouble with George. So he puts his hand over her mouth. And then she keeps screaming and struggling, and then he shakes her too hard and her neck breaks. And she dies. And then there's a moment where Lenny realizes the magnitude of what he's done, and he knows that he has to go hide in the brush. He says, I done a bad thing. I done another bad thing. He goes on to say, I done a real bad thing. I shouldn't have did that. George will be mad. And he said, and he hide in the bush till he come. He's going to be mad in the brush till he come. That's what he said. So that's what he goes to do. And so he takes the dead puppy to throw away. And so after Lenny leaves, there's just a moment where the narrator sums up Curly's wife's arc in this story. The narrator says, Curly's wife lay with a half covering of yellow hay, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. She was very pretty and simple, and her face was sweet and young. Now her rouged cheeks and her reddened lips made her seem alive and sleeping very lightly. The curls, tiny little sausages, were spread on the hay behind her head, and her lips were parted. As happens sometimes, a moment settled and hovered and remained for much more than a moment, and sound stopped and movement stopped for much, much more than a moment. Then gradually time awakened again and moved sluggishly on. So then Candy finds Curly's wife dead. And then he brings George. And George just knows that this was Lenny who did this. Even though he knows it wasn't intentional. But he knows because of Lenny's great strength that he accidentally killed Curly's wife. And so he realizes then that that's it for Lenny. Curly is going to want to kill him because Curly is still angry about his hand. So this is really the final nail in the coffin. And Curly, though, it's still it all ties back to ego with him. That his wife really is this possession rather than someone he loved. And she didn't love him either. But the men all gather around Slim, Carlson, Curly, and Curly just goes off saying it was that big son of a bitch. We gotta kill him. I'm gonna get my shotgun. And George is worried. He goes on to say, yeah, I'll come, but listen, Curly, the poor bastard's nuts. Don't shoot him. He didn't know what he was doing. And so, in another foreshadowing moment, Carlson says that his gun is gone. And so, in the last section of this novella, Lenny is waiting for George. And as he's sitting there, he has visions of his Aunt Clara. And Aunt Clara speaks in Lenny's voice, saying, I told you, and I told you. I told you, Min George, because he's such a nice fella and good to you. But you didn't take no care. You do bad things. And Lenny answered her, I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I tried, and I couldn't help it. So then Aunt Clara leaves his conscience, and a gigantic rabbit comes along. And again, speaking scornfully, saying, 'Tend rabbits, you crazy bastard. You ain't fit to lick the boots of no rabbit. You'd forget him and let him go hungry. That's what you'd do. And then what would George think?' 'I would not forget,' Lenny said loudly. 'The hell you wouldn't,' said the rabbit. So then his subconscious, this rabbit, says, 'Well, he's sick of you,' referring to George, saying, 'He's gonna beat hell out of you and then go away and leave you.' And Lenny says, He won't do nothing like that. I know George. Me and him travels together. And the rabbit just says, 'He gonna leave you, you crazy bastard. He gonna leave you all alone. He gonna leave you.' But then George comes by, and we find out that George is the one who took Carlson's gun. But he sits with Lenny first and tells him that he's not mad at him. And he tells Lenny to look out in the river, but Lenny's scared. He wants to run away with George now and start that new life that they always wanted and buy that piece of land. He asks, 'Go on, George, when are we gonna do it?' And George says, 'Gonna do it soon.' Lenny says, 'Me and you.' George says, 'You and me. Everybody gonna be nice to you. Ain't gonna be no more trouble. Nobody gonna hurt nobody nor steal from him.' Lenny says, 'I thought you was mad at me, George.' And George says, No, Lenny, I ain't mad. I never been mad, and I ain't now. That's the thing I want you to know.' And so in these final moments with Lenny, he tells the story again about how they're going to have this place together. And Lenny begs, 'Let's do it now. Let's get that place now.' George says, 'Sure, right now. We gotta. And he brings the gun to the back of Lenny's head, and he shoots him and kills him. And so George had to be the one to do it because they would have mercilessly beaten and killed Lenny, shot him to death, or he would have been institutionalized. So basically, poor Lenny was doomed from the start. And so, as I said, the foreshadowing, there were hints along the way with George telling Lenny where to hide if something goes wrong, with Carlson shooting the dog in the back of the head saying he won't even feel it. Also, actually, I forgot to mention this with Candy when he says to George at one point, 'I should have shot that dog myself. I shouldn't have let a stranger done it.' So George had to be the one, sadly, to end Lenny's life because it was the only way out for Lenny to give him that final moments of happiness and hope and the dream of getting to tend those rabbits. But sadly, that's how it ends. And it's very solemn, obviously, But then, with all that, though, basically it was against the clock because he heard the men in the distance. And so after he shoots Lenny, they come by moments later, Slim, Curly, and Carlson. And Slim's the only one who actually realized what happened, that George is the one who killed Lenny, because they first thought that Lenny had stolen the gun, but really it was George, because he had to do what he had to do. And it's tragic, but not everything is a happy ending in works of fiction. It was the best outcome that could have happened, though, because it would have been much worse for Lenny in the end. And the final words of encouragement from Slim, he says, "You had it, George. I swear you hadda. Come on with me." And Curly and Carlson, they don't know what's going on. And Carlson says, "Now what the hell you suppose is eating them two guys?" Haven't a clue. So it's a great work of fiction, and just really a great story in terms of heavy foreshadowing, yet still not predictable, in my opinion. Of course, when you go back and read it, knowing the plot, it's much more obvious, the ending. With that, that's going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com, or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, friggin' turd, join me as I discuss The Last Man on Earth. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.